Stan Gatehouse and to Once Upon a Podcast. My name's Helen and I'm here to share storytelling tips that will make your podcast shine. Today's episode is called Clear as Mud and it's about making sense. Resting quietly at the heart of good storytelling or a good podcast is structure and logic. This session is about making sure that our listener finds our podcast easy to understand. It will also help you to define what your story is, and doing that will help make your research more targeted and purposeful. To talk about structure and clarity, I'm going to be using the analogy of flying an aeroplane, domestic or international, defining flight time. Right from the outset, it's good to decide how long your podcast is going to be. I would recommend domestic, not international. A short 5 to 8 minute podcast that's thoughtfully put together and well structured can be a real gem. If you have a big story to tell, perhaps consider just focusing on one aspect of it or plan to do a series of short episodes. Setting the flight path. You are the pilot of your podcast. That means you have to know exactly where it's going. You have to know what your story is. Once you can define that and articulate it to yourself, you'll have a good basis for structuring your podcast. It will also help you understand what you need to include in your podcast and what's better to leave out. So for an example of flight path, I'm at Stan Gatehouse, which is a really fascinating place, and my 5-minute podcast could go in lots of directions. But there's one thing that interests me particularly, and that's the fact that the exquisite garden was landscaped by a woman called Elsie Cornish, who was born in 1887. And that really interests me. So if I wanted to define what my story was going to be about, I could do it like this. I'll read it. Flight path. My podcast will be about Elsie Cornish, what led her to become a landscape gardener, the gardens she made, and the obstacles she came across in her career. From that description of the flight path, I can then extract the key points, and I have quite an easy structure that I can follow, and I've got something that I can refer to when I'm researching. So I've reduced it essentially to path in, how did she come to become interested in gardening, etc. Examples of her work, what her style was, and the obstacles she encountered. This is your captain speaking. Tell them what to expect. People who go flying like to know where they're going. So we have to make sure that we tell them. So in the example of a podcast about Elsie Cornish, I could start off saying something like this. Stan Gatehouse is lovely, but the garden that surrounds it is a knockout. I was surprised to learn that the landscaping was largely done by one Elsie Marion Cornish. This podcast is about Elsie's career, the gardens she made, and the obstacles she cleared to become a celebrated landscape gardener at a time where female landscapers were as rare as black tulips. Give them the flight you want them to have. Pleasant, shocking, intriguing, funny. Podcasts can be all of these things. Define what you want your podcast to be like, and then write in a way that ensures your listeners' experiences match your intentions. Smooth landing. We want to finish our podcast on a good note, nothing too bumpy or abrupt. The way you end your podcast can be reflective, speculative, and a touch philosophic. In the case of a podcast about Elsie Cornish, I could finish by mentioning challenges faced by female landscape gardeners today, Or I could focus on some of their achievements. Or I could describe how it feels to be standing in a garden that she designed long ago. Perhaps a fragment of poetry may be a good summing up, or music or birdsong. There are lots of different ways of making a smooth landing. Just don't leave it to chance. You are the pilot, remember. That means it's up to you to work out your flight plan so that your passengers reach their destination having had a good flight. There are downloadable resources that go with this episode, but if you can't download them, don't worry, just bear these things in mind. Flight time, flight path, tell your audience what to expect, give them the flight you want them to have, and land the plane well. I hope you found this episode of Once Upon a Podcast helpful and that it's been clearer than mud.